So there's a ton to unpack about Operation Varsity Blues, the movie documentary that just came out on Netflix. But I just want to focus on one thing in this video. Something that's obviously striking to me and something that affects my business as a test prep tutor is two different times in the movie we have individuals saying, we want to get rid of the tests. To me, this was really fascinating because the two people were one individual who ended up joining FAIR Test as a movement, who was a former test prep tutor, and then another former Stanford admissions officer who became the director of college counseling at a private school based in San Francisco for years after that. I just thought it was really fascinating and strange in the context of everything that happened within the movie, in the documentary, right? We had actresses like Felicity Huffman, very powerful individuals, CEOs across the country, paying this man, Rick Singer, to help their students in clear, morally inappropriate ways to basically get their students into top colleges through what he calls a side door approach, which is basically bribery. So instead of having students get in the front door with because their numbers are good enough, or what he called the back door, which involves giving basically a huge multi-million-dollar donation and then hoping, fingers crossed, that the school takes that as a indication that they should indeed accept that student in hopes of more money to come. His side door approach was basically playing on weaknesses in the system, especially around basically elite sports and like that typically only rich white students participate in, or at least not underrepresented minorities, and also including soccer at Yale. He had basically bribed a coach at Yale to smooth the admissions process for these students who were basically pretending to be athletes, and then separately to kind of like to kind of finalize the deal, he'd ensure that these students have killer SAT scores by bribing a proctor to change the scores for those students. To me, in that situation, the test at least was the last bastion that kind of kept super wealthy parents from steamrolling the entire process. I see it all the time in school where parents basically call in to change grades. That's the first step. When they feel like, for example, that let's say a teacher might be new or something like that, they will argue with grades, or maybe there's some other extenuating circumstances. But because of the ambiguity of grades, especially basically who has power, which typically tends to be wealthy parents at private schools, start to already begin to change the calculus about the admission standards of students going in. And this plays a huge role in the grade inflation that we've experienced over the last 50 years. So it's like a big question in my mind. It's like, why get rid of the test? And he makes the point that the test is, basically follows students' income. So like, on average, at least, students from the highest income brackets are scoring the highest, and on down the line until being homeless, where you score the worst, as you might expect. But he takes this as an indication of like the test being implicitly unfair, which I think is kind of weird, because it's like every admissions officer, as he is one, knows to contextualize the student's score by the resources that might be available to that student leading up to it. Right, so they always kind of take every score with a grain of salt. This is why we know that when we work with underserved communities, we don't necessarily need a perfect score to get into Stanford or Harvard. We might need like a 1400. Everyone knows that. So I just thought it was strange, because if you get rid of the SAT without replacing it with something that has some kind of objective metric for to evaluate students, what do we have left? Like in terms of impeding rich parents from just like steamrolling everything and then making sure that their students achieve what we call academic success, aka good grades and other markers that don't necessarily have any connection to whether a student's able to read, do math proficiently, etc., etc. So I just feel like it's not a really thought through position. it's one where it's like a lot of finger pointing's going on, because I mean that same admissions officer probably played a role in accepting lots of students who had heavy donations. I used to work in Silicon Valley. I would see that stuff all the time at a high level, millions of dollars changing hands and students getting into Stanford that probably shouldn't have. So I just want to make sure that when people kind of brashly talk about vastly changing the way admissions work, it's grounded in something that's like makes sense, that where there's objective data. That's all I have for that.